Today's date is February or April 7th, 2018. We're at the Evansville Red Cross Center, and we've interviewed some people about this honor flight. So this is John Estes, an Evansville person, and he was in the U.S. Army, and he's going to tell us where he went, when he was born, and what schools he went to, and then when he got into service and what he did in the service. He's got some interesting stories. So, John, tell us where your birth date and where you went to school here.
I was born 1/21/1935. When the war broke out, I was about 5 years old, but I remember a lot of World War II because I had several uncles in it. I went to school at Carpenter Grade School and then Central High School, and after I got out of the service, I went to the University of Evansville.
Okay, before we get to that then, if you remember a little bit about World War II, our new museum talks a lot about World War II. Carpenter Grade School was the Willard House down there, the Willard Library. It was an older school downtown near the L&N station.
Actually, it's near where Channel 7 is. It's a TV station now, I think it's Channel 7.
Yeah. Downtown near on Carpenter Street, I believe.
Carpenter Street, yes.
But that's named for Willard Carpenter. Willard Carpenter was one of our founders in the city back in the 1800s. So pretty important school he went to. My dad grew up right next door to it, and his siblings, some people went to that Carpenter school.
Okay, I lived on 3rd Avenue. I used to walk by the Coca-Cola building down Clark Street and cross the Ohio tracks, and sometimes we would have to crawl under a train or around a train to get to school on time. And I don't know, it was about 8 blocks, I guess. It wasn't bad.
Coca-Cola building is still standing in Evansville. It was a real big building over there across next to Division Street there, and so he lived over on 3rd. There's near the library, near Sterling Brewery, and Clark Street is actually the address of my dad's house. But anyway, so when you were 5 years old when World War II broke out, or 6, tell me about what you thought all the hullabaloo was around, because you were pretty close to the LST and pretty close to what was happening. Tell us what you thought as a 5, because you were there age 5 to 10 when you saw everything happen in World War II, and what happened with your family, of work, and everything else.
Okay, both my uncles, one of them worked for Chrysler, and the other one worked for the Eagles downtown, and both of them were drafted into the service. But before they were drafted, my one uncle had a car, and he took us by the LST one time. It was nighttime, but all we could see was a high fence and lots of lights, and you could see there was activity going on, but you could not actually see anything in there. I found out later that was all secret stuff. Another time we went by the airport out there.
But when you looked at the LST at night, it looked like it was day because there's so many lights.
Oh, that's true.
And they was open 24/7 all the time with 19,000 employees, like a little beehive, but because it's top secret, you couldn't get in.
Later on, I worked with a fellow, I'm trying to remember his name right now, who was actually an assistant photographer there. And he told me some stories about the shipyard. One of them was how efficient the welders were there, the women welders. And when I worked at Meade Johnson, we were going to put lights in along the highway over the St. Joe, the road around now, it's named different. But anyway, they were digging, and they came up with all these stainless steel rods. And the reason the rods were buried there was the efficiency of the welders was so good that the government required them to use all the rods, even though they passed the LSTs, and they never had a bad weld on an LST, is what I've heard from him. And they buried just extra stainless steel rods out there because the government required them to use them. So they come up with bundles of stainless steel rods. Later on, Meade Johnson wanted to build out there in the parking lot where the LST was, and they could not do so because everywhere they run a core sample, there was too much steel in the way. I happened to work in an office in the shipyard at that time, the little office building is there, and the guy would come in from St. Louis, after he drilled a hole, and he'd say, we can't do anything here because there's too much steel in there. So any building out there now sits on top of the concrete because they can't dig down and dig into the ground.
Well, the LST factory, my dad was on LST for 4 years in World War II, and he worked at the shipyard a little bit. He's a little significantly older than you, but the shipyard was very important to Evansville commerce at that time. That burned in '46, the main office there, and so then there wasn't a need for building ships after that. But if you look at welders now, welders have to x-ray their goods, and they look to see if they're welded the right way. But as you said, there were not any major or minor deficiencies of the LST welds, which they did just by skill as opposed to x-raying the welds. Because now if you weld in a utility plant, you have to have everything x-rayed and inspected. And there was no inspection with x-ray at that time in the 1940s.
I realized that. My brother-in-law worked on the Alaskan pipeline. He was in charge of all the Caterpillar equipment, and they used to have the x-ray machines that x-rayed all the joints on the Alaskan pipeline. So yes, you're right, that's what they do nowadays.
Now, you said something about the LST plant. Now, tell us, your dad took you out by the Republic Aviation. Tell me what your thoughts were when you were out there.
Well, what I saw was a Thunderbird setting up with a sawhorse under the tail end of it, and he was shooting at a lump of mound of dirt out there to zero in the guns. And that's what I remember mostly about that they were firing the guns on the plane at this mound to zero them in.
That's pretty important. We made over 6,000 planes here. They were all mostly P-47s.
We made some other wings and stuff for B-25s and
at Survell Survell made the wings, but the final production plane was Republic Aviation, the big blue plane on 41, then became International Harvester, then became Whirlpool. But what John is saying behind there, the very last part of a plane, when it was done, we made 10 planes a day. Henry Ford would make 24 planes a day. We made 10 a day, which is a big feat for one every 2 hours, 2.5 hours. And when that plane would go out, they would check its magnetic heading, they'd check its brakes, and then they'd check its gun sights because they could adjust the gun sights there. So they'd go over to this dirt pile that aimed towards Sunset Cemetery, and they'd shoot these bullets out. They were Browning automatics. They're 12.5 millimeters, 50 caliber gun, which there were 4 on each side, about 250 bullets with each gun, so 1,000 bullets on each wing. And when a pilot pulled that, it would last about 23 seconds, and all his bullets were gone at that time. But for you to see that was amazing to see that last about 23 seconds, and all his bullets were gone at that time. But for you to see that was amazing to see that bullet practice.
When I was about 6 years old, yes.
Yeah. And the factory, it just looked like all kinds of work going on out there, because it's probably 1942 or 43.
It was about in that time because he was drafted shortly after that.
And then you said you also somebody worked at Chrysler. Can you tell me about what you remembered of Chrysler?
My uncle worked at Chrysler as a plumber, and he originally started out at Graham Page Company and morphed into Dodge and Chrysler. And when he came back from service, he went back there. He was in an engineering battalion in Iran. What's Iran nowadays? It was Prussia at that time. Huh. And he told me one story about coming back where one of his buddies was shot off his shoulder by a sniper. And he always wondered about that. But he served a couple years as a draftee.
And what did he do at Chrysler? He was a plumber?
He was a plumber.
And it was during the 30s and 40s?
30s, 40s. He retired from St. Louis.
I see, because Chrysler was in Evansville from 35 to 58, and they moved over to St. Louis 58, took a lot of employees over there. Before Chrysler started, it was Graham Page, as Mr. Estes says, very important to our contracts in World War II. Chrysler was our biggest contract. It was the first contract awarded in about January of 1942. Then the LST, then Republic Aviation, 1 month subsequent, like February, then March, was when all those contracts were. But Chrysler was the blockbuster. It showed that we could produce things. They changed from cars. There were 3 million cars made in 1941, and we didn't make any the rest of the war. Now we make about 17 million cars in 2018. So, but Chrysler was a big production plant here at Evansville. They would take them to the Evansville shipyard and put them on the ferries or on the barges and send them down. But Chrysler made 3 billion bullets in that building you're talking about. 3 billion bullets. So you stand them end on end, 3 billion, be 3 times around the world, 75,000 miles of bullets. And he was part of all that.
And they stored some of those bullets out at the 4-H Center in those huts that are out. Well, the parts of the concrete that are left out back down behind the 4-H Center.
Yeah, they got a lot of that, what Mr. Estes is saying, that the 4-H Center still got a bunch of mounds in the back, but a lot of the ammunition was stored out there. And if you look at all the people that, if you look at National Archives, there's National Archives in D.C., and the one that owned ours, there's 12 different National Archives in the United States. One in Chicago, South Chicago, is in charge of ours, and we've photographed a lot of that information, and it's hard to deal with ammunition. So Chrysler and that up by the 4-H, it's hard to get rid of that area because nobody wants to deal with ammunition. The LST was a little cleaner than some of the Chrysler stuff. And then the other plant was Republic Aviation. That was a clean trade because they just moved to International Harvester. But what Mr. Estes is saying is very important with ammunition. We were incendiary bombs and ammunition here, and also repaired the Grousers and the Sherman tanks. Did you ever see the Sherman tanks go around out there?
I did not see them, but I know where the track was. It was down 41 down that way around by the Donut Bank on Diamond Avenue. And I understood they had to drive them 25 miles, I think, or something like that.
They had to
before
test
they
them.
would approve them.
Yeah. They'd take them all the way apart and put them back together, about 1,600 Sherman tanks. They didn't make any here, but they took them all the way apart, put them back together after the troops had damaged them or in practice field messed them up. Now
some of those Sherman tanks were converted to vehicle track recoveries, and I worked on some of them in Germany. What they were is they put a big boom on them, and they would boom would pull the tank out of the ditch or wherever it had to be. And they had a Ford V8 engine in them that had a 5-inch stroke and 5-inch cylinder piston. And I used to have to work on those.
Huh. Well, that's pretty. So when part of your Army time was over there, and you saw that coming out of, it's ironic coming here out of Evansville.
Right.
So then that was really, we're talking about just your early times in your life. Did you have anybody that was injured in your family, or anybody that worked in any of the other factories, or anybody go to war in World War II?
Well, I had another uncle that went in, and he was in the invasion of Italy up through there, and then he was on Anzio for 6 days, and that was a pretty hot battle. He told me a few stories which probably shouldn't repeat, but he wouldn't name himself, but I noticed on his records that I have at home that he earned a Silver Star with clusters. So he must have seen some hot stuff.
Silver Star is about the highest award you can get. That means he sacrificed his life for somebody else's. It's one of the highest the Army will give. My uncle died in World War II, and he got the Silver Star. But you don't believe how big of a star that is, that big award that is. That must have been, he did something very significant. Anzio was a terrible battle in Italy. We thought we were going to take those Italians on pretty easily, but that lower on that boot was a very difficult battle, very tough. The Italians and the terrain there was terrible. Yeah. So anybody else World War II that you can remember at all, John?
No, I could remember a story from my days when we had rationing and you had to have the windows shut and closed at night. And I remember once when I was about 6 years old, I peeked out the window, the front window, and my mother went into high rage. You're going to get us killed, we'll get bombed. And that was the theory that they had at that time, the fear that if you turned on the lights in the city at night, somebody could bomb you.
A lot of that was happening in London, and my mother was really scared of somebody doing something here in Evansville, but it was in your mother's subconscious that lights were on, somebody would maybe do something to you. So she was very fearful at that time.
Oh, yeah.
So then we pass on to, you're born in 35, so you went to what grade school? Are you in high school? You said Carpenter?
Carpenter and then Central.
Yeah.
And then I joined the Army in 1954, September 1954, with a buddy of mine. We were sent to Fort Leonard Wood first, and on the bus ride to Fort Leonard Wood, I'll tell you another story that's connected to the Korean War. I worked at a furniture factory here in Evansville, and they were talking about...
What was the name of it?
Bartles Manufacturing Company out on Florence Street and Park and Florence at the time. But one of the stories out there, a fellow named Watson had a nephew who was killed in Korea, and he was always told that it was shot with an artillery shell. On the bus from Indianapolis to Missouri, the guy sitting next to me said, "Oh, you're from Evansville? My buddy in Korea was from Evansville that got killed." And it's kind of weird because it was the same guy, Buford Watson, and what had happened to him, he said, was they were retreating, and one would go back and fire and the other one would come back, and he went back, and as he turned around to fire, his buddy got up out of the foxhole, and a Chinese hit him in the head with a rifle, and he was killed by blunt force trauma rather than shot by artillery, as the official Army statement was.
Was that the Chosin Reservoir where he was?
I'm not sure exactly where they were. He wasn't a Marine, I don't think. He was Army.
Yes.
I had a high school teacher that was in the Chosin Reservoir. He was my gym
Tex
teacher.
Graham.
Tex Graham.
Yeah,
And-
he's at Chosin Reservoir, yes.
yes, and I met him a little bit later on. We were at another meeting somewhere.
Yeah, he was a heck of a guy, best golfer, coached for Central, did all kinds of things. But Tex Graham was, he was on the Chosin Reservoir. In the Korean War, what happened in Evansville is there's a lot of guys signed up for reserves, and they grabbed a whole reserve unit from Evansville, and there were a tremendous amount of people from Evansville, Indiana, that went to the Chosin Reservoir. The Chosin Reservoir, people don't know, was in Korea. It was 30 below for a couple months, and they surrounded them. They never thought they'd get out. Somehow they got out, and it's really sort of a miracle they ever got out of that.
Okay, if we're on Korea now, my brother was there, and he was in a Repo Depot down south. He decided one day he wanted to go up north where the action was, and he got in a truck and rode with the truck driver up there to deliver supplies, and they were attacked. And when they got out, they had to jump the ditch and keep running because they had zeroed in on the ditches. And if you jumped into the ditch, you would be killed. So that's another Korean story.
Wow.
My other Korean story is I served in the 3rd Armored Division with a fellow who had been in Korea, and he was in Graves Registration, and he was telling me a story about how the Chinese or the North Koreans had tied 13 South Koreans together and threw them in a river in the middle of the winter, and they had to get them out and try to handle them, which was a very messy situation.